Good morning, everyone. We're going to start or continue our series. We got off of it for a week or so of the 12 disciples / 12 apostles. And we talked about several of them, but I'm going to start out today with James the Lesser, because there are two disciples named James. One is called James the Lesser, and that can just mean he was smaller, shorter, or younger. And then there's James the Greater, and that can mean he was taller, he was older. So James the Lesser may have been shorter and younger, who knew? But this James, because they were both disciples, there's two Jameses, and one of them is the lesser, and he is also Jesus' half-brother. They have the same mother. It's very confusing in the scripture about Jesus' siblings, half-siblings, but it plainly says in the word that Jesus had 4 brothers, and it says he has sisters. So Jesus has at least 2 or maybe more sisters. They are not named because in those days it was all about the sons to carry on the name. But that's all right. But if you look at, and I'm not going to go there, I'm just going to read some of this to you because we've got so much. In Matthew chapter 13, 53 through 57 is where it speaks about Joseph and Mary and their family, their sons. He had a brother named Joseph, a brother named Jude. He had a brother named Simon, and then, of course, himself. And we see that he also has sisters, but we don't know their names. I'm sure somewhere in church history there is their names written down, but it's not in the word. Now, James, he is known as Saint James after he passed away, but he is the brother of Jesus. He's from Galilee, and he also wrote the book of James. So it's only 5 chapters, but if you look in the book of James, it's a very loving book, and it tells, basically, it's a job description for pastors. That's what the book of James is about. It tells you how to treat your sheep, how to act as a shepherd. And the reason is because after the death of Christ, when the church was born, after the day of Pentecost, James, the brother of Jesus, set up the first Christian church. And that was set up in Jerusalem. Now you see the other disciples going out into other areas, Asia Minor, even England and Africa, Italy, to preach the gospel of Jesus. Because before, all they had was basically a Jewish church. So they set this up, and he was there for 30 years. So he was there a while. Now, if you look at Matthew 27:56, Apostle Paul talks about the 3 pillars of the church. The 3 pillars of the church is John. That John is Jesus' cousin John. Mary had a sister named Salome. She married a man named Zebedee. and she had 2 sons, and they were known as the Sons of Thunder. They were kind of rough guys. They, before they became Christians, they did what they want. They did how they want. And Zebedee was a wealthy man. He owned a commercial fishing business. So they were a little more spoiled than, let's say, Jesus was. But that John is the John. It's also the John that wrote the 5 books in the Bible. It's also the John that went to the island of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation. And it's also the John that when Jesus was on the cross, John was there and John's mother was there. That's the other Mary. When it says other Mary, that is John, son of thunder, Mary's sister, was there. And it also says that he said to John, John, mother, son. I'm paraphrasing. And so what he meant by that was, you are responsible for Mary from this point on. Now, it doesn't mention Joseph anymore in the word, and historians believe that was because he had died. A lot of people say that Joseph had another family, he was a widower, but a lot of theologians and historians said, if you just look at when Jesus was 12 and they traveled from Nazareth to Jerusalem, they did that on foot. It was a 4-day journey. Now, if Joseph was an elderly man, that probably would not have occurred. That's their rationale behind that. So not only did he travel 4 days, he went out a day and a half when they realized Jesus wasn't in their company, and then they traveled back. And it says when they got back to Jerusalem, it took 3 more days before they located Jesus. So an elderly man would not have been able to do that. So that's their rationale behind that. But back to James. The book of James was written around 40 AD. It's only 5 chapters, but when you do read it, you can tell that he has a pastor's heart. A lot of times in his writings, he says, beloved, when he's talking about the people in his church, beloved. He was also called James. He had 2 nicknames, James the righteous and James the just. If you read the prayer that's in the 5th chapter of James 5:16, you can see the prayer that he says there about his flock, and you can tell that he loved his people. Now, he did not believe when he was growing up in the house with Jesus that, Jesus was anything but his brother. He didn't, they didn't see Jesus as this Messiah. They just saw him as, oh, that's my older brother. And when things started happening, that's when he started believing. And he got saved. A lot of times people think when they get saved, it's going to be some big monumental thing. And many times it's just, you've come to the light. You see. And a lot of people say, well, I've done too much. You just don't know. Listen, if he can change Paul, a killer of Christians, and he can change me, a sinner, partier, AKA whatever you want to, I was in all of it. But he saved me. And I didn't have to do anything except ask. And that's the same thing James had to do. And James, they had a council there in Jerusalem, and Paul was on the council. James, John, there were several of the disciples on the council, and they basically set up the bylaws for all the churches, because that founding church was the thing to be replicated. And James was martyred in a horrible way. You guys know all the disciples, minus John, were martyred. They were killed. And James, the Pharisees got really upset. We talked about the Pharisees. The Sanhedrins are the folks that were rulers of the Jewish law, the temple, everything. There were three parts to them. The Pharisees, they were the very conservative part of the Jewish law. They followed the Mosaic law, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, to the letter. Then there were the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees were more liberal. They did not believe in an afterlife. They did not believe in a resurrection. They did not believe in angels or spiritual things. And the third part of that Sanhedrin was the Scribes. Now, the Scribes were the law experts. And if you've ever watched anything on Jewish or studied Jewish law, when even the scribes were copying the scrolls, it had to be exactly the same thing on the same line. If that got messed up, start it over. So they were very precise. So, but the Pharisees, which we know you had to be 30 years old and you had to be a married man to be considered to be a Pharisee. Paul, when he was Saul, he was a Pharisee. So the Pharisees get upset because now there's a lot of people that used to go to synagogue. They've gotten saved, and now they're going to James's church. That didn't go over well. So, yes, that's correct. And so they took James to the top of the temple and threw him off. But he didn't die. Remember when we talked about John? They put John in boiling oil and he swam around in it and never died. Same thing happened here. So they go down from the top of the temple and they stone him. He still is not dead. Then finally they decide to get clubs and they beat him in the head and he does die. But you can see these folks back in, the first century, they really had a difficult time because this was new. This wasn't something that anybody knew about. And, they knew that there was going to be a Messiah, but what they thought is he was going to lead the Jewish people. He wasn't going to start a whole new religion. He wasn't going to have the same thoughts and things that they did. They thought that he was just going to be their leader. Little did they know that God had a different plan, a plan of salvation. And even though this was going on at the time, they tried, even the folks that was going to James's church, they tried to take some of those Mosaic laws and bring over to the church, like you had to be circumcised. You couldn't eat certain foods. These things were, and James and Paul, who were on this council, said, no, that's the Mosaic law. We have a better covenant. Jesus died on the cross. He picked his blood up, it says every drop. He arose to heaven, poured it on the mercy seat, and forevermore we do not have to kill animals. Because usually at Passover, when they were coming, they would go to the temple, and they, because people are traveling for long ways away, it wasn't like you could go out to your field and get a lamb and bring it in for 7 days and check it over, make sure it was spotless and perfect. So you would go to the temple, and according to what your sin was, you would go to the money changers, and there was different kinds of money in the land there, okay? So they would say, well, might be 2 mites for a dove or a lamb or whatever. Well, that's why Jesus, the story of Jesus upsetting the money changers' tables, is because if you've ever been to a foreign country and you go to the bank and you exchange money, the rates are different every day. However, they were skimming money from the people because the people didn't know what the currency was in other lands. And so Jesus found out about that and overturned the tables. He was angry that they were cheating his people in the synagogue. So if you look up here on the chart, we see that, and I'm sorry for you out there on YouTube and Facebook that you don't have the papers, but you see here that King David is at the top, Nathan, his son, and Solomon, his son. And Solomon is Mary's direct descendant, and Nathan is Joseph's direct descendant. Now, Mary has a sister named Salome who married Zebedee. And you see she has 2 sons, John and James. And I put these up here because this James and the James that I'm reviewing today often get confused. That is not the James that wrote the book of James. That's Jesus' cousins. It's also James the Lesser, who wrote the book of James, cousins. That John is the John who wrote the 5 books in the New Testament. He was the John that swam in the boiling oil, and he was the John that was also banished to the Greek island of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation. And historians believe when he did get banished, he took Mary, the mother of Jesus, with him. Because remember, he's responsible for her. So he had to go take care of her. Because that was one of the last things Jesus asked of him. So, when, I think it was around 62 AD, when James the Lesser was martyred and killed, he was 94 years old. So, so that would have put him at about 32 when Jesus died. So he was an advocate of Jesus. He did. I'm sure he wished he would have believed that his brother was the Messiah sooner, but he didn't. But and some people believe that Mary was not the mother of Jesus' siblings. But if you look in Matthew 13 and Mark 6, it says Joseph and Mary's children are. So they were his half-siblings. And in Matthew 13, it says, "Is this not the carpenter's son?" And he names his brother, mother, and sisters. And then in Mark 3:21, they're talking about Jesus, and they say, is he out of his mind? This is Jesus' brother speaking, when they didn't realize that he was the Messiah. So another point of clarification, where it says the word at the bottom, Clopas and Alphaeus. Those two words are exactly the same meaning, just like when Jesus changed Peter's name to Cephas. Cephas means stone or rock, and it's the same thing with Clopas. And when it says that Clopas, the mother of, or Clopas, Mary, it is Mary, the mother of Jesus. Yes.
You know, when you're talking about a lot of people don't believe Mary had any other children, a lot of Catholics believe that. My sisters couldn't believe she had sex.
Well, it is because it says that.
The nuns who instilled that in to stay pure and clean.
Well, and there is a little bit in the word that says that she, Joseph put her away, and he put her away until, they didn't have relations until after she had Jesus. And I believe, this is my opinion, I believe that happened so there could be no question where Jesus came from.
They don't read the word.
No. Also, in 1 Corinthians 15:7, it says, Jesus appeared to James, and he repeats James and John. So he's not talking, when he says he appeared to James and John. So James, the son of thunder, which is a lot of times confused with Jesus' half-brother James, there's another point that it says there are two James. So just for backup, so you have that. So we wouldn't have a church today had James not set up that church. And he and John were in that council in Jerusalem. Paul, John, and James the Lesser, or James the Just, were on that council. Also, Peter. It says in the word that Paul named 3 men pillars of the church. That was James the Lesser, Peter, and John. So they were the ones that set up our first church. So we know that when Paul and Barnabas, which we talked about last week, when they came back from their first mission trip, one of the first places they went to was to meet with the council. Because remember, the first trip, Paul isn't setting up any churches. He's going to get folks saved. He does write a letter to Galatians on his way home, but he has not set up any churches. It came to him, a revelation, I believe, on that trip was, I've got all these people saved and converted to Christianity, but I don't have a church for them to, so-called, spiritually grow up in. So when Paul and Barnabas came back from that first trip, they went to meet with James, Peter, and John, because by this time they have the church set up. Now it's called Christianity and not the way. When the disciples and Paul were going around and ministering to these people, it was called the way. and there's a few churches still called the Way, but after that first trip, James started calling it Christian. So we have him to thank for that, and the Holy Spirit to thank for that. And even when Paul, remember I told you those people were trying to bring over Mosaic law into Christianity. And a lot of the letters in the Bible that Paul gets back from Philippi, Galatia, Ephesus is, do our men need to be circumcised to be a Christian? Remember, it had a thing, one of his questions we spoke about last week was that they had questions about marital relations, they had questions about the Mosaic law, and you have to realize when they've converted, most of them are already circumcised, but they're concerned because now they're having other children and they don't want them to be left out, because the Jewish law is on the 8th day, the boy children will be circumcised. So that's where that came from. Okay. Now I want to go over Peter. Kind of finished with James. And someone here asked me, their Bible said when I talked about Peter and his father being named John. During these times, I think, Karen, your Bible said Jonah. Jonah and John are the same name during this time. So it is correct. And his surname, or his name that was given to him, Simon, is the Hebrew name, and the meaning of the name is listener. So if you go and read through the Bible, when we talked about the 12, Peter has a fiery temper. Remember when the Roman soldiers in the Sanhedrin come to the garden to get Jesus? He gets up and whacks his ear off with a sword. And Jesus takes the ear, puts it back on the soldier and says, Peter, we do not do this. I'm paraphrasing again. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. So Peter, after he converted to Christianity, he had a little growing up to do. Peter was initially from north of where Galilee was, in a city called Bethsaida. Now, Peter and Andrew is the first disciple to see Jesus and hear Jesus speaking about Christianity. He goes home because he's living with Peter and his wife in Capernaum. He goes home and says, brother, you've got to come and hear this man. Because Andrew was a disciple of John the Baptist. So he had been following John the Baptist around. And how Andrew came to know Jesus is when John the Baptist baptized Jesus. And there was an audible voice from heaven. A dove came down, and the audible voice said, this is my son who I am well pleased. Andrew experienced that. And he sees this, and it must have been profound because he immediately went back and got his brother Peter. And we talked when we discussed Andrew. Andrew is not mentioned. The 4 people that are always mentioned is Peter, James, John. Andrew's in there too. Because if you wanted it says that if you wanted to speak with Jesus, you had to make the appointment with Andrew. So Andrew was the gatekeeper, because I would imagine there's a lot of people coming, good and bad, to see Jesus with this new thing that's happening. So it says in 1 Corinthians 9:5 that Peter was married. In the Word, it says that John and James, on these missionary trips that they went to preach the gospel, they took their mother. So it doesn't say that Peter took his wife, but I'm sure if John and James took their mother, he probably took his wife. And remember, John and James is married, his mother is Salome. She is Mary, the mother of Jesus' biological sister. So Jesus, John and James are first cousins. Mary and Salome's cousin is Elizabeth. And Elizabeth and Zacharias had a son, and that's John the Baptist. So that is Jesus' second cousin. John the Baptist is Elizabeth's son. Married, and she's married to Zacharias. And remember when Mary, in the little Bible story, when Mary went to visit Elizabeth while she's pregnant with Jesus, when she comes in to where Elizabeth is, she's also pregnant. Elizabeth said that she felt the baby jump inside her because he was in the presence, a spiritual presence. Remember that story? So that's. Go ahead. In utero, yes, he was filled with the Holy Spirit in utero. Yes. Peter is the Aramaic name that Peter has, and Cephas is the Greek name. We talked about that. They both mean stone or rock. So if you see that in either one, it's the same thing. Peter is also one of the pillars of the church that Paul talks of in the New Testament. Okay, if we look at Peter is called Simon in Matthew 1, Luke 4, Luke 5, Acts 10. It's still the same. John, in the book of John, John calls him Simon Peter 17 times. Same person. So it seems like when Peter, remember now, just because you get saved doesn't mean if you've got a fiery temper, it goes away. It's something you got to work on. I had a very fiery temper.
No.
Yes. If I thought it, you knew it. And I didn't care who it was. And God has worked with me on that. But on occasion, and you guys have seen it on occasion, it pops out. I'm not proud of it, but I'm a work in progress. I haven't arrived. I make mistakes. I'm not sin-free. I screw up, and I have to ask forgiveness. Well, when Peter acts like his old self, it looks like in the New Testament, they call him Simon. And when he's Peter, more Christ-like, they call him Peter. So you can look at that and see that in the Word. Peter is the spokesperson. You see that when anything happens, he's the one that is saying what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, when they're going to do it. He's also the one, when Judas betrayed Jesus and killed himself, they needed a replacement. And so they're all deciding how this is going to go. And Peter decides that they'll draw lots for who's going to replace Judas. And the man that won the lot was Matthias. And we really don't see much about Matthias in the word, but he was the replacement for Judas. Now, Peter was also martyred. He is in the Basilica of Rome. His remains are. He ended up being crucified, and he's asked them, because his Savior was crucified on a cross, he said, I am not worthy to die the same way. So he was crucified on an upside down cross. And that was his request. It says he was a chivalrous man, quick-tempered, leader. Peter is also the first person to declare Jesus the Son of God. You refer in the New Testament, it says, Jesus, the Son of Man. And then there's a time when he says, no, he is truly the Son of God. And you know, if you've ever been, I'm going to give this story about Pastor. The man that trained him had a big church. He was a Peter. Talk about fiery. The first time I went to the church, now he's a smaller man, and I'm a sinner, so guess where I sat? Back row, back seat. He walks on the back of the chairs over to the back row. I'm thinking, wow. So, and he had probably 10 or 12 people that, handle different things. So he gets in the hospital, and he's got Brother Nolan, Deb's brother that's went home to be with the Lord, a wonderful man of God. He's got Pastor and several others there. And he's in the hospital bed, and he's, barking orders, you do this, you do this, you do this. And in walks his mother, his little tiny mother. And she just berates him. What in the world are you doing in here letting yourself get like that? I tell you what, sometimes, a mother just has to come in and do it. And so she goes back outside, and he looks all of them are looking like they would never talk to him like that. And he looks at him and he said, do you know what a big fish is? They look, no, sir, we don't. It's a little fish away from home. Well, Jesus was a big fish, but they knew him as the little fish because he was ministering right there where he was raised. Isn't that Jesus, the carpenter's son? Well, yeah, it is. So they had a hard time wrapping their head around, how could this be the Messiah? He's the carpenter's son. He's a Galilean. How does that work? Well, sometimes, but Jesus didn't have that same problem when he went out of town. If you read, he was performing miracles. And when his mother was at the wedding locally and called for him to change the water into wine, He said, it's not yet my time. He didn't want to do it. But out of love for his mother, he did it. So these people are seeing signs and wonders that Jesus himself and these disciples are doing. I mean, if one of them can walk by and the shadow touching the person restores them, imagine what a touch from Jesus would have done. So, and you know, Jesus wasn't out there before he was 30, just, you know, doing all these things. He wasn't performing miracles because he knew it was not his time yet. But when he did get 30, he did know it was his time. And that's when he started appointing the 12. Because he knew he needed the message that he was carrying to progress even after he had left. And when we talked about Apostle Paul, we talked about he never met Jesus. He never spoke to Jesus. But he surrounded himself with people who had firsthand knowledge of Jesus. They saw him, they lived with him, they spoke with him, they saw the miracles he did. That's the people they needed to know this Jesus. Tell me, I'm hungry for what he did. I need to know. And it's the same thing with Barnabas. We talked about this last week. His nephew, some say he was a cousin or a nephew, John Mark, who went on the first trip, half of the first trip with Barnabas and Paul, he wrote the book of Mark. But if you read the book of Mark, half of what he talks about is in the book of Matthew, and the other half is in the book of Luke. And the reason for that is he spoke to those two individuals who had firsthand knowledge of Jesus and what he was like and what he stood for. And so there is some other things in there, but if you look at it, there's a lot of that in the book of Mark. So Jesus knew he had to get the word out, and that's why he picked these people. And if you look at them, the 12, there's nothing special about any of them. Nothing at all. They're ordinary, unlikely people. That lets us know that we don't have to have any specialty. God picks people who are willing and available. And he'll do the rest. Just like when we talked about your purpose. A lot of people came up to me and said, well, I don't know what my purpose is. How do you know? God already equipped you on the inside. He equipped you with everything that you need. When your spirit was knitted into your mother's womb, you were the full package. Everything that you needed for life was already there. Now, are there things that happen to people along the way? Absolutely. Are there things bad that change their outlook? Absolutely. But you already have who you are, what you are, when you're born. Your little guardian angel, when he comes down and brings you, puts you in your mother's womb, and he's standing garrison there by the mother, and he's standing there to make sure that that baby comes to full term and to protect the mother as well. So Don't ever think that you're not good enough, that you don't know enough, that you've done too many things wrong. If God can take those men, fishermen, and make them disciples, he can surely make me a Christian. That's not near the step of doing that. So this week, you think if something comes to your heart or somebody comes to your heart, reach out to them. Pray for them. And it's a simple prayer. Romans 10, 9 and 10. If somebody asks you how to get saved, it's Romans 10, 9 and 10. A book written by Paul to the Romans, his people. If he can take a killer of people and make him an apostle, he can do anything. So think about that this week. God bless you. And I think we've got, let's see, I know I've got Doubting Thomas to go through, and I've got James the Greater. And we'll probably do that next week. And then we will have the 12 unlikely heroes of Jesus, because they very much are unlikely. Thank you, and God bless you.